Welcome, everyone. I'm Purna Kupat. I'm a computer scientist and lawyer with the Max Planck Institute for Informatics and also a fellow at the center hosted by Dirk at Bucerius Law School.
That's right. My name is Dirk Hartung. I'm the executive director for the Center for Legal Technology and Computer Science at Bucerius Law School in Hamburg, Germany.
Yeah. So, and as you can see here on this picture, we came to Singapore to present in person precisely to also find the right picture as the heading for our talk. So we hope that in this talk, we can actually convince you that we should care and share. So hopefully you'll care to share. And let's start right away with what this actually is all about. And it's perhaps important to say that sharing and caring unofficially between the two of us has been known as, this doesn't work as well, okay, as the rent paper. So what does the rent paper mean, and why do we actually feel like we have to write a rant? So this is basically what we're going to be talking about, and let me just jump right into the introduction and tell you what the trigger for this rant was. So it says a trigger and not the trigger because there are actually many triggers, but you might have been in a similar situation perhaps in the past. So this is what happened. We ran as part of another project into a legal data science paper that made quite confident claims and didn't have any accompanying data and code. It's perhaps a very unusual situation, but maybe some of you can relate. So we looked at the data science policies of the journal in which it was published, and it turned out that no data or code release requirements had been in place at the time that the paper was accepted at the journal. So what do you need to do in this situation? Well, you make an attempt to obtain data and code. And so we wrote what you could see as the perhaps like most possibly non-threatening email to the authors to just inquire about whether they would see themselves in a position to share data and code. And then, and this is what kind of the trigger was, well, we were given quite interesting reasons in the subsequent correspondence for refusing our access to data and code. And so I'm just going to give you three as our personal highlights. So the first can be paraphrased as resource exploitation in the sense that one reason is, well, we're still working on other stuff that's based on the same data, so you cannot have the data. The other is, well, so we were actually asked, what do you plan to do with the data? And we were honest about what we plan to do with the data, which is basically poke around in it, do this, do that, other types of analysis. So we're open. And in the subsequent correspondence, you could kind of feel the fear of getting scooped, as if there weren't enough problems for everyone anyways. And then, this is my personal favorite, make sure that you say my collaborators don't have tenure. So they're the ones who are worried about the originality of the work, not yourself, no. I mean, this basically caused me to kind of explode, and then Dirk kind of tried to put me back together. And we're like, we definitely need therapy. So we made similar experiences in many other situations in the past, and the conclusion was just this must not continue. So as our personal therapy, we wrote this rant paper, and we hope that some of it is useful for our community as well to come together. So why would you listen to this rant? Like, really, what is our experience? So our authority, right? Well, we've been producing research, especially in the space of legal data science, and these are some links. I think the slides are also available that you can easily click on. Mostly complex network stuff, network analysis, also some ideas from software engineering being ported to the legal domain, some stuff with natural language processing, but mostly in the space of legal data science. Then we've had some experience with reviewing research, both for special issues of technical journals and also for legal data science that was sent to law journals. And lastly, as consumers of research, we've had to deal a lot with other people's papers, other people's data or not available data, and also other people's code. So that's kind of the backdrop against which we're developing all of these ideas here. And our goal, and this is important, is to start a discussion to establish best practices for publishing computational legal studies. And it's really the goal to start a discussion. This is a starter and it's not the final word. And hence we also have many disclaimers. First of all, we make mistakes too. Let's all learn from them. So, I mean, you can point out mistakes that we made. We can give you anecdotes about our mistakes. It's all fine. Let's just get better. Then we also don't claim to know better. So we might have some controversial ideas and please push back. We're all like somewhat lawyery, right? So we can handle that adversarial atmosphere as long as it's friendly. And also this is about science, so please don't take it personally. There won't be any names, but you might kind of feel caught in some ways. We're sorry, don't take it personally, it is not. So with that being said, let's dare to challenge some current conceptions, or rather actually one, which is the answer to the question of what constitutes a publication. And commonly, people think of publications as papers. And this is a classical law type paper, which has two components, not drawn to scale, sometimes drawn to scale, text and footnotes. And we have CS type papers, which are much more diverse in their composition in the sense that they might have text, tables, math, figures, pseudocode, and references. And at the same time, while law type papers might be fairly self-sustained once you know the text and read all the footnotes and followed up on the literature, that is not the case for most of the CS type papers, because the tables and figures are based on something, and that's kind of the stuff that we don't see in the actual paper, which is mostly data and code. And that together, we argue, should be considered the publication. So if you just publish your CS type paper, it's not self-standing and nobody can actually check the results. So you might have just as well made up stuff, hopefully you didn't. But we need to be able to check all of the results that went into the paper, and that's why we need a publication to also comprise the data and the code. So this brings us to the question of like, okay, where are we as a field? Computational legal studies. Computer science, obviously CS type papers. Computational science also has CS type papers. And we argue that most of the stuff that's happening in our field, not only in legal data science, but also in computational law, is also CS type papers. So we're having these papers, which means that for our field, papers really aren't publications. Papers are elements of publications. They're important elements, but they're just elements. So this brings us to the question of how do we actually share these publications? And the primary point here will be that we need to try to make them really reproducible. So not in theory, in the sense that, you know, if you collect the data yourself and then write some code, you'll in some world be able to reproduce the results, but rather make it as easy as possible to reproduce other people's results. So what's needed for that? So let's start with the scientific meme that kind of wanders around the literature by Stanford geophysicist John Clairvaux, who is a champion of really reproducible research, which states that an article about computational science, and we take it that computational legal studies is also largely computational science, in a scientific publication is not the scholarship itself, it's merely advertising of the scholarship. So you might wonder, what then is the actual scholarship? And Clairvaux also has something on that. He says that the actual scholarship is the complete software development environment and the complete set of instructions which generated the figures. So this is his particular context, extended to tables. The message is clear. We need all the data and code that went into producing the stuff. So this brings us to our first two principles, which are really simple. We developed 7 of them in the paper, which means reads, release your data, very simple, and release your code. So that leads us to 3 questions. What data and code should be released? How should we release it, and when? So let's start with the what. And here we're going to be a little bit slanted towards the direction of data science because that's what we know. It means basically releasing all of the stuff in all of the steps of the data science lifecycle. So the raw data and the code to acquire the data, to pre-process the data, to use or reuse the data, to post-process it, and finally also to archive it. And that in itself doesn't suffice in the sense that people who've tried to reproduce stuff will run into issues with computational environments, so which Python version, which package version, and so on. Share the computational environment as well. There are some legal restrictions that we need to adhere to. We argue in the paper that we should construct them in a narrow fashion and, if possible, also make available derivatives. And then there are some overarching concerns, which we argue shouldn't be concerns, in the sense that you might argue, well, my code looks bad. Everyone's code looks bad. Choose the CRAPL, it's in the paper, the CRAP license for academic purposes. And also triviality, in the sense that, like, this is really easy to write. Yes, but it's not about me proving that I can write your code. It's about you proving that your results are derivable from what you're saying you're doing. So this is about the what. Let's talk a little bit about the how, because many things can go wrong here too. Let's start with how not. Not upon reasonable request, or upon unreasonable request, because any request is reasonable. Also not from your personal website, because your website might move or die or something, or you might die, we hope not. Also not from your institution's website. And I think you've all had experiences similar to this, in the sense that you're clicking and you're excited on one of these links and then it's dead. We don't want that. So how can we ensure that the resources are there and are accessible? By following the FAIR principles. So findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability, abbreviated as the FAIR principles. You can look up online, you say something more in paper. Those are the standards that we should try to establish. And then the question is, of course, how do we do that? One easy way for findability and accessibility, which are very important here, is to assign a persistent DOI, digital object identifier. You can do that via Zenodo or using some other digital archives. Zenodo is one that we've used successfully in the past. And then for reusability, I think an important point is to really think about how you should bundle your data and code. Because if you want to reuse something like 3 years from now, you're going to need to maintain the code, and you might have wanted to update your data set. So we argue, and this is something that we've done wrong in the past as well, to actually try and separate out the data and the code, and then to make sure that stuff is actually reproducible, do a wrapper release in which you document what is the final brick that's missing here to ensure that your stuff is reproducible, which is also your workflows. So we have the third principle, release your workflows, which is basically telling everyone, telling to the world how to tie together your data and your code to produce the results of your particular paper. And finally, when should the data and code be released? Well, it should kind of be obvious, but we're making the point anyways, because this was a problem in the trigger that we experienced with the first non-preprint paper using them, of course, because that's one of the things that we're going to need to have reproducibility for. And that applies even if putting all of this together was a lot of work, because it usually is, and we should share our work such that other people don't need to do that as well. And even if you plan to work with the data or code in the future. And the rationales for that, again, pretty simple: reproducibility of the first paper, efficiency in scientific discovery, especially if it was hard, please share, we do too. And then finally, and this is kind of a little bit of pathos at the end of my part of this talk, the norms of science as also identified by Merton. So universalism, communalism, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism, where the italics tells you which ones might be violated when you're keeping your stuff to exploit it. So please share your data, share your code, share your workflows, write with your first paper, and you're going to have a head start on your subsequent work anyways. And if that's what you're capitalizing on, then maybe you should try and think about new ideas as well.
Okay, that concludes part 3, and we're up for caring. And this is all about constructive community criticism. Also, we like words starting with the same letter, as you can put it. So, I want, for a whole brief second, I want to talk about community. All these, this feels a bit like softy, like squishy. This is a hard science conference. What I mean by this is, we're in a somewhat good position. There are established parts of our field but also a newly interest. So this in part is a new field, a young field. But regardless of whether your field's old or young, we can always shape it. And I think the ultimate goal is that we should be caring for each other, and that of course includes each other's work. But because the people that you meet here and at other such conferences, probably the people you're going to be meeting for a significant portion of your professional life, at least for a couple of years until you move on or decide to become a crypto billionaire or something. So we can shape this. We can make this a nice community that people like to work with, and that is extremely important if we want to attract new talent and people from outside the field. So this is not like a kind of softy, we all dance our names kind of situation, but this is what we believe an important moment to think about our field as a whole. And I'm very grateful for the conference that set up this topic of like past, present, future, that got us into thinking about this. So that's what we mean by caring. Now, caring can be done pre-publication, in publication, and post-publication. And here I start with pre-publication, and I have conveniently already given you the structure. That's it. There will be 3 parts. A lot of 3s also. Prime numbers, generally a good idea. Again, it's questions. So there's the what of pre-publication criticism and peer review. There's, of course, who should do it, the who, and then there's how it should be conducted. Now, peer review is not controversial and very controversial. I discovered in preparation for this talk and the paper that there is a huge field of scientists that are looking at how peer review works and how these things interact. I encourage you to read up on it. So our conclusion from that is there are deficiencies, certainly, but it's also the worst alternative except for all the others. So we're stuck with peer review, but we have some ideas, some suggestions how we could make it work in our field. So what should be reviewed? Pretty obvious, publications, not papers. That increases workload because you have to look at the code and the data and make sure it makes sense to you. But it's the only really motivator we have, because at this point in time, when you're the peer reviewer, you hold the power to say, can I please have your code and data? And this is when people will comply because they want their work to be published, right? So let's do that. Some might say, but what about confidential data, confidential code? How do we handle that? And I'll just say there are ways around it. Like we have worked with privilege and confidential data in the past. And typically people understand that when they work with scientists, these scientists need to show other scientists what they've done. So for review, I'd say there should be an exception. Now, maybe not everything can be made public because you're working with commercial like data that has a lot of monetary value and they won't give it to you when you don't promise to somehow protect the interests. I think that is a reasonable position to take, but at least for the review, that should not be valid. And of course, we can always work on derivatives. So not the raw data, but maybe the first derivative that you have created. In our case, like such your networks, your graphs, for example. Our experience is that typically companies are happy to if you lay out the reasons and if you sign the appropriate paperwork. Now, at this point, I just quickly want to mention that this is all intended as a call to fellow researchers, because that's really all we need. If we all agree on this and we all do all the work in the field, then that's fine, but it scales much better if we get the journals and the other publication outlets behind it. That is what top guidelines are for. That is transparency and openness promotion guidelines. So if you want to look that up, people have put a lot of thought into this, and they can actually rank journals according to how open or how strongly they promote these principles, transparency and openness. Some of that is not as relevant because pre-registration does not always play a big role depending on the type of work, but generally it's a good idea to kind of follow that when you think about journal evaluation and where you want to go. Now the who, first thing, maybe controversial. I don't think that in our current field, double-blind peer review is actually possible, because from most papers I have blindly peer reviewed, I know who's written them because I know who does what. I can also, if someone has about 50% of the references to a certain person, fair chance that they're reviewing it. Also, as a reviewer, someone suggests me you should really look at this work that was published in the 80s. Fair chance that's the person that's reviewing my paper, right? So I said, let's stop pretending. I said, let's blind but seeing. So let's be honest and just indicate to the editors when we believe that we might have identified someone. It doesn't stop me from giving a fair evaluation. And I think if it stops you from giving a fair evaluation, then you should just say so, right? So I argue, at least when the field grows, things will get better because more people will be involved and you cannot follow everything. But right now I have a fair understanding of who is writing what. And I think we should just acknowledge it, as is some parts of computer science, for example, do that. You can just indicate that you might have identified the person. Then we need what we call a review recognition service, because this is a lot of work, especially if you look at publications, not papers. It probably will take a couple of days to get it all running. So it should be counted as academic publications, just like other things are. Because people need time to do this, and they need motivation. I think the biggest motivation in our field is recognition, it will help you advance in your career. And so I firmly believe that we should do that. And we can make it easier for the reviewers. I'll talk about that in a second. And then there's the very likely possibility of overextending the reviewers. You can see that in computer science right now, that ahead of big conferences, you get like 6 papers assigned and then another 4 emergency review papers. And what happens is that you get sloppy because you're exhausted. You have probably handed in your own work. You're expected to finish all this in a very short time frame, and that drives the quality down. You start not following up on the math. You start not really getting into the data, running tests on it. So ideally, we want to avoid this overextension, and especially so because the easiest way to do that is just to ask people outside the field, and that's not a good idea, right? Because then suddenly someone's reviewing that's not really following what is state of the art. So we got to make sure that we do as much as we can as authors to make the review easy, so that we don't overextend our reviewers. And then a couple ideas on the how. One is transparency of your level of comprehension and certainty. So just indicate how well you understand the paper. And it could be that you understand one part well and another part not so well. That's perfectly fine. And then when you make your judgment, you could feel really confident about one part, but maybe not about another one. And I think it should be standard practice to indicate what's what, because I know that I can better understand certain things and I don't understand one graphic. And for the editor, this has to be transparent. Then, of course, the whole interaction is socially interesting. I call the good, the bad, and the ugly. Good papers are absolutely breeze to review. Like, it's good stuff. You point people in some directions, they'll do it, it's done. Bad papers are a tough case to do because you have to do a lot of heavy lifting for the authors. But if they follow, they really, really profit from peer reviews, more so than good papers. And then there's the ugly. That is, you really make an effort to thoroughly review it, and authors just can't be bothered, or they just half-heartedly say that they will do it in future work or something. And here we just argue, for simple thing, reject it. Like, if not every step of the communication advances the paper, then it's okay to reject, because that's also what needs to be happening. And that will lead to the last point here. That's about speed. Let's make it fast. It doesn't take more than a long weekend to review a paper. So there's no reason journals give people 2 months and then you forget about it, and then another month. And maybe it's because we have been in review for a very long time at a very well-known journal right now that I'm saying this. Hey, everyone, you know who you are. I think we should make it fast, because it's much better for the authors. It's better for our field, and typically you can. I think it's a problem of prioritization. And once we make these actual academic outputs in hiring decisions and the like, there is a strong incentive to actually be speedy. Okay, that's the pre-publication thing. Principle here is review rigorously. Principle 4. Talk about in publication while you're writing. My big message is mistakes happen, and they don't only happen in our field, but you may have heard about this. This is from the field of chemistry. There was a script, Willoughby Hoy, that was used in a great number of papers, and that while the operating system on Mac changed, so did some of the assumptions that the people who wrote it. And then, as it said here, about 150 plus papers were called into question. It just happens. It's a difficult business that we're in. And so I mainly highlight this because of the great reaction that Patrick Willoughby had to it. Someone pointed it out, and he said, "Hey guys, that's really great. I didn't realize it wasn't working. You fixed it. We should all check our results and papers and then move on." So this could be an embarrassing mistake, right? But he just accepted it because we all make mistakes. And I think that's the kind of error and mistake culture that we should adopt. It's okay to find mistakes as long as we correct them and not hide them. Okay, so for in publication, that means that we would like you to keep it real. First of all, that's caution with regard to your results and modesty with how you phrase them. And by caution, I mean explore the full model and parameter space. We've heard that for initial work, it's okay to just go through a couple of parameters and establish where you are. But towards the end, maybe in the supplementary materials, I want to know what it all looks like. I want to know what happens when you change parameters. And I mean, things like sensitivity analysis, robustness checks, they should be standard practice. And if your paper doesn't have them, it should not be accepted. Elation studies, especially for machine learning, should be a standard practice that we understand how individual components work. And then, of course, there's not only exploration, but also explanation. That means our choices with regard to how we model things are judgment calls that go into a lot of this work, because you require legal expertise quite often to figure out how to best model the data. Those should be explained so that people can understand them. All of that is especially important in an interdisciplinary field, because we're dealing with a very diverse audience. In all the papers that have been presented, people presented important caveats and said, look, this is under the assumption that, and this is under the assumption that. If you are not quantitatively trained, you might not understand these limitations. When people say, well, we assume that this and this, it's very easy for someone who is more of a doctrinal, qualitative scholar to overinterpret, to misunderstand. So let's make sure that, that's why I say keep it like modest. Let's make sure that we guard our papers against overinterpretation. I had a discussion yesterday about predictive studies and how people understand these words differently. And so it is a real danger in the community. So we say, let's keep it let's guard it as good as possible against overinterpretation, because our methods are so great. They exude objectivity and confidence, especially to doctrinal scholars. And that's why we use them, right? But it is important to kind of tone it down and make sure that we're not claiming something we're not doing. Here's the overinterpretation. And that gets us to the fifth principle, which is tell it like it is. Okay, post-publication, here we go. So we're coming home on the home stretch. What happens once we have, like, research has been produced? Well, the first thing I want to talk about is related work, because this is where we reference others. I have a simple claim here, that is, let's be selective. Let's not treat this like everything remotely in the same letter of the alphabet thing should be named, because this is only how we can evaluate really qualitatively good work. And also it's okay to say if we're not big fans of some work. So that's the related work section. We want you to make engagement easy. So again, saving time, that is, findability would ideally be served in a living survey so that not everyone has to come up with their own surveys every now and then. So it should be a continued collection of actually reviewing each other's work. And of course, accessibility comes from true open access, which can be hard to negotiate, especially with prestigious publication outlets, but which make it much, much more likely that people cite your research. Second to last point is on replication studies. They are important to check that things go well. And we should understand that questioning someone's result is not questioning their scientific integrity. It's hard. Like, no one wants to be proven. When you get a request for someone who wants to replicate your results, your initial reaction is, I don't know. I'm right. They're probably wrong. Let's make this less awkward. There are good suggestions that we point to in the paper for collaboration protocols with people who are trying to go for replication studies, for both the people who do the study and the people whose studies are replicated. And this is also a great opportunity, by the way, for students, because you can learn a lot from replicating papers and studies and get feeling for it. And it's also a great way to outsource some of that replication work to the people you teach. Okay. And then, of course, you have to regularly revisit your papers, code, and data, which is something that we've done for this project. It's a bit painful because you realize all the past mistakes and things that you know better now. And we figured you need a category for it. We call it personal metazorizing. There should be some way of saying, look, for this publication, look here for all subsequent discoveries of what we think we would do different now and the improvements we could see. Now, ideally, you would start with a blog or something, but maybe we could incorporate that into a publication culture. The self-correction is a part of our research routine, and if it's not, then it should become. This is our second to last principle, criticize collaboratively. And our last one is really big picture outlook, where to take it from here. And you guys are probably familiar with the difficult choice of publication outlets. So should you go to law journals? Should you go to empirical legal journals? Should you go to general science journals? Maybe it's rather books for you, or conferences. All of them have certain deficiencies. I don't know, it's very hard to really get people, editors at a law journal, to care about the quality of the figures, or like print in color, for example. Not everything we do is empirical, right? General science, you always have to show that this is interesting beyond just one single field. So it's not, you're not always reaching all the people that are looking for knowledge in our space. Books, and peer review are difficult, let's put it that way, and they take forever to come out. And conferences are great, but we know from computer science that the conference culture encourages very piecemeal publications, and we want bigger things too. So ideally, it should be a digital first publication outlet. It should, of course, employ rigorous review as we've defined it. It should publish publications, not papers, and all of that under the roof of open science. So now you might think it's a house, but no, it's not, because it will host a living survey, and the mat is arising. And so bear with me here. It's not rocket science, even though it could be. There you go. So let's make sure the rocket takes off. Think about where this publication outlet could be. Maybe it's the MIT Computational Law Report. Maybe it's the Journal for Computational Legal Studies. Maybe just call it Computational Legal Studies. I don't know. Maybe it's a stupid idea. What we want is for us all to come together. And here are open questions for our discussions. Are we wrong? Are we alone? Do we have it all mixed up? What should we do now? Do you want to join us in thinking about this? Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Marina. Do we have any questions?
Thank you so much, Dirk. So one of the points that you discussed there is about making the research data open, which I think kind of goes into the disclosure scope kind of area. So how would researchers mitigate such things like client attorney privilege or litigation privilege, for that release data if the researched matters are in dispute or litigation space?
So of course, the precise implementation of these principles and also the extent to which they can be implemented depends on the data you're working with. Our recommendation of what I said about this comes a lot from the data that we think should be available to everyone, such as statutes and court decisions. If you're working with data that's more sociologically inclined, let's say, in the sense that you're actually you're working with clients, then I think one way that is also enabled by some of the deposit archives that are out there is that you can actually deposit your data under constraints, such that people might unlock them for research purposes or only if they sign certain agreements. There's also other communities that one might look towards, for example, the medical domain. And they've been around for quite some time, and they've had similar problems, especially in terms of identification or so. And they try to make the data available by depositing it somewhere where you need to register in a way, or make sure that certain checks are done before you get access. So what I have in mind right now is pretty much the brain data domain, which is also very sensitive. So we can kind of look around and see what principles that have already been developed in other sciences can apply to your particular kinds of data, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel. But for example, I know that Zenodo has a couple of options that are not totally open access, but rather under certain conditions, or even with email to someone, where then the problem, of course, becomes what if your email moves? But so it shouldn't preclude us from depositing somewhere the definitive data that we used in a particular study. And even if it's just for you in the future to make sure that you actually use that version. So I think this will be a lot about making sure that there is no unauthorized access, but it shouldn't preclude us from depositing the data.
Just one minor addition, and I think I mentioned it in the talk, is if it is illegal to share the data, then you can't share the data, right? That's for sure. Interesting question is, how did you get the data in the first place if it's illegal to share? But I'm sure maybe you can work with the next processing step that does not contain the originally privileged data. In our case, graphs. Maybe make sure that they can't be reverse engineered, right? Model hacking is a real thing. But I think that creatively there should be some thought put into it. And that, of course, makes research projects a little bit more cumbersome because you have to agree on this. But my experience has been that it works out better than one would think.
Yeah, well, and maybe the last point on this, if you really think all of the stuff that we've said so far is not going to work, think about differential privacy and what could be done there, because that's kind of what the US did for their census to make sure that things are not identifiable. Of course, there are concerns that you're actually going to destroy the data for the sociologists working after that, but that's also an option, and you can mathematically prove certain privacy guarantees.
So that kind of works in the area where we can look at the final state of the outcome, right, of the data. For example, discussion from yesterday with Masha, with citing European court cases and trying to predict them. But what about capturing some other, what I would call invisible data? So if we take, for example, either a white-collar crime, let's say defense, or criminal law, when there is some data that is being that is invisible data, what I would call invisible data, is present in an oral argument to judges, then even more invisible data would be the, let's say, defense scenarios or prosecution scenarios that are not, that just disappear after every single case. So how that is being captured?
I don't have a straightforward answer, but I think I would rather err on the side of reproducibility and say, well, if it's that difficult to unlock, then there might be other potential data sources to work with that are more easily unlockable. Because you're right, there are scenarios where it just can't work out, but then creating a publication that says, this is what we found, though I can't show you because otherwise the mob is knocking on my door. I wouldn't be comfortable with that either, I guess. But
and I think one thing to definitely adopt that we didn't discuss a lot in this case, because this really seems a lot like you're also doing social science research in a large part, or like criminology, pre-registration in some sense. So like you can publish the protocols, you can like document a lot more detail about what you did to at least enable replication in the sense of doing the same thing with different data. So even if you cannot unlock that, but you're going to have the data somewhere, and you can at least like make an effort to archive it in a way that at least you're going to be able to unlock it in the same state at some point in time. If it's encrypted, how are people possibly going to get to it? Then think about how you can enable selective access for researchers under NDAs with identity checks, whatever. So I think it's of course it's a hassle that it's so much thinking and that we're spending so many words on this. But I think it's really like it adds a lot also to the discourse to kind of document the difficulties of making your research replicable or reproducible in that particular space.
I see. Interesting.
Yeah, I sort of got the question coming from opposite direction of the one that just been asked, which is in cases where there is no real issue sharing data because it's help from different sources, but where there are projects with relatively huge amounts of data, we're talking about billions of records. I think some of the presentations you see, they've got millions of word vectors. I'm more concerned about the potential practicability of sharing those data sets in a single source. So while I can appreciate the aversion to hosting it on, say, institutional websites as opposed to centralized area, mightn't there be practical difficulties in consolidating those amounts of data in one place?
It depends on what sizes you're particularly talking about. I think Zenodo has like 20 gigabytes or so of upload like limits. If you're much above that, so I've worked with neuroscience data in the past. Neuroscientists have huge data, like fMRI data is huge. Like you're talking gigabytes per person that they scan. They found a way to do it. They're using distributed infrastructure. They're using AWS with like sometimes request or pay. Sometimes you're just you're getting like verified pieces of the data down, and they're using Docker infrastructure also to kind of publish their apps such that then you can kind of pull it together. So I really think that like we're not the people with the largest data. There are people of much more data. And if they can figure it out, we definitely can as well.
I think it goes to the where to take it from your question, because I think it's a very valid source of like a stream of discussion about what are the requirements for such infrastructure? How would we ideally host it? I think our don't put it on the institutional website was more like make sure that when you change institutions or when the IT departments of the institution perform surprisingly, unexpectedly, not as we thought they would, then it's not all gone. That is, I think, the direction which you're thinking. And I think there should be research on how to collaboratively create an infrastructure that's reliable for a global community.
Yeah, and I think we have this with web service as well, right? So I think the way that the neuroscience community works is they have this distributed infrastructure that's a little bit like that. You can also implement your own access stuff. So I think that's really the way to go. Also to share computational resources, by the way, because you're going to need a lot of those if you're going to analyze that big data.
So in your talk, you mentioned that sometimes these highly quantitative methods exude confidence in a way which tends to impress the more qualitative-minded people. And I think this is a feature of our interdisciplinary field. We've got the techies on one side and we've got the fuzzies on the other side, and there can be some confusion. And I think at the intersection of these fields, we sometimes have the unfortunate phenomenon of machine learning, natural language processing. We see a lot of papers where sort of we analyzed this large corpus of text and we got some kind of result and we would like to share that result. And we have a number and the number is 93%. It's actually 93.5%. We don't really know what that means. Enjoy the paper. Do you have a comment on that particular phenomenon that seems to be occurring?
My first shot at it would be, remember what I said about the review process? So that would be my first direction of, then again, I don't want to be too strict because people start out somewhere, right? But in my very personal opinion, I understand, I recognize a lazy paper. Where you're like, okay, this is, you got the improvement that you wanted to go, then you cut out all the rest and that's it. I think I would still probably leave it to the community to then either engage with that piece of writing or not. And I think it's very difficult to make, or it can be you can be very easily wrong when you start to like get rid of these types of papers. But I agree that the worst type of interdisciplinary work is work that would not like pass in one domain or the other. The best one is one that would pass in one domain and the other.
So I also think that in general, we're in a field in the intersection, which is harder than the respective individual domains because you need to combine the expertise from both fields. And that should also kind of ultimately be the goal, or at least that should be a kind of the top research that's happening. But at the same time, so I think, or I have the hope that eventually as the field grows and matures, we're going to have more people who are actually much more interested in adapting the methods that come from one field to their actual use case in the other field than just boilerplate copy pasting, because that's never ultimately going to give you a lot of insights. I think it's great for student projects, and if we have an outlet for that, that could easily go there, and people can actually it's a learning paper. I think that's kind of what we should have a space for also, but it should be clearly distinguishable from the rest, because otherwise you might spend a lot of time reading it and then get disappointed.
Right.